So it there's evidence. This is to me hard evidence that stories work, right? They can really get my attention. Why do they work? What's the psychology of storytelling?
Yeah, I think part of it. So there's, as I was preparing the book and looking at this, I started to see what kind of research is out there from a psychology or from a neuroscience perspective. And the interesting thing is that, and I won't harp on the system 1, system 2 that you already talked about, but for those who may not have heard that other session, our brains basically process information through 2 systems. This comes from Daniel Kahneman's work, behavioral economist, Nobel Prize winning behavioral economist. And he published a book called Thinking Fast and Slow, a very famous book. So I'm sure many of your listeners have heard of it. But basically, system 1 is that intuitive side of our brain that processes information unconsciously and is constantly looking at patterns and heuristics. And then once it's kind of pre-processed that information, whenever there's any information that needs further processing or thinking or analytical processing, it goes to system 2. And that's the traditional brain that we think of when we're thinking of consciously processing information and thinking thinking logically about it. But that system 1 is a big part of the reason why we like stories, because at the end of the day, what are we trying to do as human beings? We're trying to make sense of the world around us. And so what do? We form things into narratives. We create narratives around related to politics, related to our careers, related to how we interpret the world as it is. And everything kind of fits into these narratives that we create. And so a lot of the time we're looking at the world, we're processing information through narratives. And so what that means is, when you have a fact and the interesting thing was neuroscientists looked at this and they said, we have a flight or fear flight kind of mechanism in us, built into us, right? So if we were hiking along a trail and we ran into a dangerous predator, a lion, a tiger, a bear, we would have this reaction within our brains of, oh my gosh, we're in danger. Well, when neuroscientists looked at the brain and how people process information, and if you're presented with a fact that maybe conflicts with your viewpoint, the brain, the response that it has to that fact is the same that it has to these predators. So we actually we are designed to protect our viewpoints, and we're very defensive that way. And so we go on defensive with facts and data. But the interesting thing is that when psychologists look at how people process stories, they noted that our guard goes down, that we're more open to new ideas. We want to hear where the story goes. We don't nitpick on the details like we do with the data. And so, and even the psychologists found that we can enter into a narrative, they called it narrative transportation, where we're almost like a hypnotic state. I don't know if I achieved that with you recently with that story, but we enter into that. Yes. Narrative transportation.
Because I was imagining those hospitals and the women and the struggle, and I went with the flow. I totally forgot I was even here in my study,
So that happens, and that opens us up to new ideas, and it's very powerful. And so that's why we need to pair. In the book I talk about, we have the logic, we have the data, and our goal is to then pair it with a story to reach the emotional part of decision making. And that's a side note that I started in analytics, and I came out of MBA school, and I felt like if I could just provide data and the right insights to the decision makers, they could make the right decision. And that's all they needed. And I completely dismissed the role of emotion in decision making. But it actually, when neuroscientists look at the role of emotion, it actually plays a bigger role than facts or data do. And there's a neuroscientist by the name of Antonio Damasio. He's he's at the University of Southern California in the neuroscience area. and he worked with patients that had damage to their emotional centers of their brain. So they basically were emotionless. I mean, they would look like you or I, but they didn't have emotion. And the interesting thing that he found when he would try and schedule a lunch, like for example, he'd try and schedule a lunch appointment with these patients, and he started to observe that they really struggled with making a decision on where to eat. A decision that you or I, if I came to Sydney, we could make a decision in a minute or two where we would go to lunch. Yeah. Whereas these individuals, they would vacillate back and forth between the different options. They would say, well, if we go to the sushi place, they have the special I like on Tuesday. But then again, the Italian place is easier for parking. But then again, the servers are friendlier and they go back and forth between the different options. And so 20, 30 minutes would go by and they're still trying to make a decision on where to eat. And so Antonio Damasio realized that emotion does play a key role in decision making. And so that's why, again, storytelling is important, because it gives us a bridge to connect with that emotional side of the decision making, to help form a narrative and help people, help them to make better decisions. And so it really is a critical part of how we should be communicating insights.
It's funny, like it's almost a feature reduction process, for the folks that are used to analyze data. Sometimes you have this large tables filled with columns, 20, 30, 100 columns. And one of the first things you do is understand which columns matter more. So you go through this reduction phase and you eliminate the noise. And it's a very mathematical, solid process. But here, it almost feels like our emotions are acting as a sort of filter. They create these patterns and shortcuts to help us focus on the things that matter more to us, as opposed to get lost in the infinite trail details.
Right.
I never thought that an insight was like a lion. I think this image was going to stay with me, Brent. You have an insight, something that's going to challenge your belief. Think about that as a lion.